My name is Peter Pomerantsev. For those of you who don't know, this, you're at the Legatum Institute, you probably know that, which is an educational charity and think tank. And I'd like to thank the Legatum Foundation for their generous support and to make our whole program and our many other projects at the Institute possible. I mean, our vague agenda, for those of you who aren't here regularly, is trying to promote this idea of prosperity through revitalizing capitalism and democracy. And one of the projects that we have is the Transitions Forum. And underneath that is a small project that I run called Beyond Propaganda, which looks at developments in propaganda across the world. The last big event we had, we looked at how authoritarian regimes are becoming much cleverer and how they befuddle their own populations. We looked at Venezuela, China, Syria, and so on. Today, the focus is on a subject that a lot of people think they understand, but actually they don't understand it at all. It's about this very overused term, information war. When I first heard of information war, I kind of imagined two propagandists shouting at each other. Here's capitalist propagandist shouting at communist propagandists, and each one tries to persuade the other one that he's right. Then, as I began to read more about information war theory, especially in Russia and China and other places, it suddenly dawned on me that actually, when they talk about information war, they're not talking about it the way media talk about it. They're talking about a military theory, the use of information for various military aims, to throw the opposition off balance, to divide and conquer, and so on and so forth. All of this had very little to do with information as I understood the term as a quasi-journalist. One of the most overused words in the discussion about information war is a word called narrative, which I thought, again, that I understood as somebody who'd studied sort of literature once upon a time and someone who tells stories. I always thought that narrative meant, well, kind of anything. It's the clothes you wear or the argument you make during a discussion. Mark Laity, who I'm going to introduce now, who's one of the authors of our wonderful new publication, Information at War, is actually going to start today's public event with a much deeper look at how people in his profession think about the word narrative. Mark is absolutely unique. He's a former journalist, BBC defense correspondent for 20 years, something like that, but then crossed to the other side and now is head of strategic communications for military operations at NATO. I almost got that right.
You did.
And he's going to actually kickstart today to get our to get our ideas flowing with a look at how people in strategic communications in the military think about narrative and how they understand narrative. So we'll do that, and then we'll bring on our other authors.
So, Peter, thank you. So this is slightly unusual. What I'm going to show you is a shortened version of what we actually do in the military to take narrative and turn it into policy, and then to turn that into strategic communication. So bear with me, because this is a little bit unusual. Most people, when you say narrative, you think story. But as Peter said, it's an incredibly overused term, and yet it's very important. And the reason is that we live our lives in narratives. We're all living our own narrative. Our family, our background, our country, each one of those contains a narrative. And we're a little bundle of narratives. And if I want to persuade you to do something, I need to tap into your narratives, to speak in a language you understand. Not just the language of English, in this case, but your story, your family. Because if I don't tap into that narrative, then I don't speak to you. So, here is a scene of medieval Kiev. So why am I showing you this? Because it's about history. You see the phrase at the top, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. Now, there is a statement. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. Ancient Rus is our common source, and we cannot live without each other. That's Vladimir Putin. And he said that the day that they annexed Crimea. So there's a narrative. Ukraine, Russia, we're together. We're one. What's Russia's strategy with Ukraine? Russia wants to embrace Ukraine. So its strategy is to, in effect, critically influence, if not absorb Kiev. Its narrative is, hey, our background is the same. So the strategy and the narrative line up. The same thing we have here. This is St. Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev, and this is what President Putin said about him. President Vladimir predetermined the overall basis of the culture, human values that unite. The civilization of Russia, Ukraine, and the Belarus. Now, the Eurasian project is Putin's grand strategic vision. He wants a Eurasian Union. And what are the three key elements of his Eurasian Union? Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. So he is using a narrative attention. We're all the same. We all share Prince Vladimir to achieve a strategic effect, strategic narrative. So let's look at that a little bit more. So at the top, I've got what I've made up, but I think it's accurate, a narrative one-liner. The fascist junta in Kiev illegally toppled the government. They're oppressing our Russian brothers in Ukraine who desperately needed and wanted our help. All very emotive, right? Narrative. So, why is he saying that? Because it helps justify Russian military intervention. Because if our Russian brothers are being oppressed, why wouldn't we intervene? So, the narrative is aligned to the strategy and it's mutually supportive. We'll come back to that. Notice too the historical narrative. The appeal before, fascist junta, nasty. So fascism is something Ukraine's against, Russia's against. World War II, the Great Patriotic War, the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. All of these things appeal to Russians. They also appeal to a lot of Ukrainians. They appeal to a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Multiple narratives. Now, Russia wants to appeal, and a lot of this is legitimate. You want to appeal to many audiences, you frame your story. You want to appeal to this kind of audience? Okay, so you don't like America? Then they have a narrative for you. We want a multipolar world, not a unipolar world. So who's that going to appeal to? New nations who are growing powerful and think it's their time for a place in the sun. Russia has a narrative. You're conservative, right? Well, Russia is an outstanding supporter of conservative values. They have a narrative for you. You don't like America. Russia has a narrative for you. So they have multiple narratives. And if you look at Russian statements, you will see there's something for everybody. And then they use tricks and techniques. The fascist junta in Kiev. Now, a fascist junta, that's basic. It's not good, is it? All right. Now, that's what you call framing. If you call it a government, that's what it is. You're not framing it. You call it a fascist junta, you're already thinking this isn't good. Now, these are standard tricks. Everybody could do them. But the Russians, along with others, but especially the Russians, they do a lot of these things. Mirroring, framing, priming. Standard tricks. Any ad agency can help you. So now look at the bottom there. There is another one-liner. Now, if you look at that, sorry, I'm just going to sit down to see that. In order to pressure and destabilize the Kiev government, prevent its westward orientation, we will use active and as necessary military measures to provoke and then regain Crimea and as necessary a separatist enclave in eastern Ukraine. Okay? Now, that's actually pretty much what they've done. That's a strategy. But if you look at that bottom statement and then look at the top one, they're the same. Just one is framed as a narrative, emotive, resonant, and the bottom one is a strategy, a strategic narrative. Now, we can all do this. The three elements of successful communication go back to old Aristotle. Logos, pathos, ethos. Argument, passion, moral authority. The most important one is not argument. That's the least important one. We like to think we think, but in fact most of us don't. The things that drive us are our passions. And what we do is we listen to people with moral authority. You may be regretting it now, but you're listening to me because you assume I'm an expert, right? So you have lent me some authority, and hopefully I'll live up to it. So you've given me the ethos. But I'm telling you, whether you like it or not, the pathos is more important to you than the logos. So how do we turn this? Make this real, because this is all very esoteric. But I'm a chief strategic communications. This is what you'd call a narrative arc. Now, Steven Spielberg could use this. It's the basic 4-block approach to how you do a story. You have a problem. You want to solve it. You then do various stuff to solve it. And then at the end, you've solved it. And you ride off into the sunset with a girl on the back of the horse. Okay? Standard narrative. But look underneath there. You have a situation, objectives, execution, end state. What that is the 4 standard phrases that you would use to create a military plan. So satisfaction becomes end state. So actually you have an alignment between a narrative and a strategic plan. Who knew? And when you say that, we do this. This, you can see from the top, is the ISAF narrative. This is a real narrative. It's out of date now, so don't bother taking it down. Dating from 2010. And they actually used the narrative form to create a narrative for how we did communication in ISAF. And then they turned it into reality by putting it at the top of the hierarchy. So you see left and right, campaign plans, stratcom plans, effects plans. On the left, subordinate narratives. Every part of ISAF was using this narrative to do real operations. Not just messages, but real operations. So when they planned a military offensive, at the top of the hierarchy was the narrative. So, how do we then turn this into an effect? We use a thing called frameworks. So we have an introduction, no core message. We then say the objectives. The military love objectives. We all love objectives. What are we trying to do here? What's the aim? What are we and this is something that's essential. It's no good just saying stuff. Where are we trying to go? Remember our narrative arc. And then we have themes and focus topics. That's what we're going to do, our events. And then we have coordination. Because I'm not just talking about communicators. I'm talking about people who fly airplanes, drive tanks, drop bombs, dig wells. So we have to coordinate with all of those. So let's then turn that back to whoops, that's not so good. There we go. Let's turn that back. So there's our narrative. Then we have our strategic plan. And then we have our stratcom framework. And see how they all align. Now, I show this because we do this. This is actually what we do. And let's turn it then into today. There's our friendly narrative arc. So what's our problem with what's going on in Ukraine? Well, the Russians are a challenge to the post-Cold War order. We had rules. The Founding Act, the Vienna Document, the Helsinki Act, all of these things which said this is how we do business. And the Russians are challenging them because they want to re-establish a sphere of interest. They don't want to take control of Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine because Ukraine wants to. They want to do it because they're bigger, because they think they're entitled to. So there's our problem. So now what are we going to do? Well, we need to protect the rules-based order. We need to give small nations choice. So what actions are we going to take? There's our arc. Well, we've taken sanctions, At NATO, we're providing assurance to nations that are worried. We're supporting the threatened. We're living our values. We don't respond to lies with lies. And then we have an effective narrative. And then, if it all works out, and this is in the future, mutual security is respected. That includes Russia. Russia's entitled to security as much as the rest of us. But every nation, big or small, is entitled to security, to secure borders. So there you have it. Now, that is not a plan. That's a framework which then needs to be implemented. But unless you know what the problem is, unless you know what you're trying to do, unless you know where you want to go, then it's just tactics. It's just running around doing stuff. You need to have this kind of approach in order to decide how to do it, to make sure you know it. So, a very short run through, but that is how we think and do stuff at NATO. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much. The first time I saw Mark give a similar presentation was in Kiev, and the room was full of Ukrainian generals and bureaucrats. And I don't know, their eyes looked interested, but yet very, very kind of like shocked that this was the way to think about sort of military strategy. This is also a very good time for me to say thank you very much for everyone who's joined us online. We are much more than this small room, including sort of trolls and hackers. I'm very glad you're with us as well. I'm going to step back a little bit. So that was a fascinating insight, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about how NATO thinks about narratives in an age of information war. But let's go back a little bit. One of the fascinating pieces of your essay here is that you deal very briefly with the Russian idea of what is information war. Could you lay that out very, very basically for us? What do they mean when they say information war?
The term that the military use is information confrontation, which is interesting in itself, the fact they refer to it as a confrontation. And it's a multi-phase effort in peace and war. It starts with covert operations. It goes through all sorts of stuff, then it becomes active, then you have your crisis, and then it's re-establishing peace and order. So we tend to think about peace and war. The Russian approach at the moment, the military approach, is best described as information confrontation. They've done slides on it. I'm not making this up. This is not even controversial, frankly. And when you see the slides they've done from their own Chief of Defence Staff, you'll see that information confrontation bridges between peace and war. And it goes from covert actions until the end. So potentially, they are carrying out information confrontation, warfare if you like, long before we think war has started.
So it's a perpetual thing, a bit like sort of Trotsky's permanent revolution. It's permanent information war all the time, regardless of whether two countries are officially at war or not.
If they have an objective, they're effects-based. I mean, if they're happy with the way things are, they won't be having an information confrontation. They're not. So if they have a plan, if they want to get somewhere, they are not going to wait for us to decide a war has started. They will start it. So, you know, the military use the term effects-based. The Russians are very effects-based. Where do they want to go to? And they want to go to places, and they want to do it, if possible, without going to what the military would call kinetic actions, in other words, a proper war. So if they can do and succeed in their objectives without a shot being fired, they're going to do it. But the thing is that they're conducting that information confrontation.
Laura, spinning the globe to the other side of the world. I was quite surprised in your paper to find that the Chinese idea of three-way warfare sort of echoes the Russian one. Can you give us a very quick description of what is the three warfares?
Sure. So it's very interesting what you say, Mark, because it's very, very similar to what the Chinese do today. They see the three warfares, if I quickly define them for you, are media warfare, which is a constant ongoing activity that's aimed at influencing perceptions, influencing public opinion. They'll use Xinhua, they'll use CCTV, all of their major news platforms, they will use that in order to influence public opinion. Secondly, they have psychological warfare, so they really want to disrupt an opponent's decision-making capability. So that's targeting really civilians and military in order to influence doubts, to foster, sort of a second guessing of an opponent. And then thirdly, you have legal warfare, or also called lawfare, which is an exploitation of existing legal customs, legal systems, so leveraging particularly the law of the sea, and using that to a particular effect to blur legal distinctions, to leverage it in a way that isn't, it wasn't designed to be used in a way. So, and again, this is really pre-kinetic. So, I mean, they've learned from Sun Tzu in terms of winning without fighting. So essentially, they want to be able to use the three warfares to condition that operational environment to their advantage, so that they never need to get involved in any sort of infrastructure destruction, kill ratios, the tangible things that in the West, and particularly in the US, that is used to define military success.
I was going to ask, because I mean, for those in our audience who aren't familiar with your work, I mean, you were director of research on a massive 500-page, actually it reads like a thriller, sort of Cambridge University study for the US Department of Defense. But, that's sort of like the immediate question as a journalist that I get is like, well, doesn't everyone do this? Don't the Americans do the same thing? Don't we do this? Black ops, it's not as if the West is sort of like, doesn't know the term information operations. So is this different, and how is it different?
Sure. Well, I mean, interestingly, the Chinese have actually learned from what the US did in the two Gulf Wars. So the way that they were able to leverage sort of UN sanctions, be able to use the media, campaigns, they have learned from that. And there's not really anything new per se in terms of looking at psychological operations. They've been doing that for thousands of years. But what is new with this is that it's been combined, and it's really applied in a holistic and concerted way. So it's approved in 2003 by the Chinese Communist Party, by the CMC, which is the Central Military Commission, so the supreme leading organ of the armed forces. So it's really got top-down direction that perhaps it wouldn't otherwise have if it was just applied in its disparate way. So it's really this concerted whole being able to be applied against multiple people, multiple audiences, in multiple scenarios for a really, essentially, very cost-effective way.
Give us one small example, just so that we're very clear of sort of the three warfares in action. Maybe, the South China Sea seems to be the main sort of field, the battlefield that we're sort of familiar with. I don't know, maybe some of you have started seeing these slightly bizarre stories of the Chinese suddenly creating islands in the South China Sea. Give us a little bit of how that isn't random. That's actually part of a much larger strategy and a way of looking at war.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I don't know how many people are familiar with the South China Sea, but there's lots of reefs, lots of submerged rocks. And what the Chinese are essentially doing is dredging the seabed, getting all of the sand, putting it on top of each other and transforming that into an artificial island. And then the three warfares really come into play. So firstly, in terms of legal warfare, they're then saying, okay, so this is an island, it's legally justified, this is our national territory. Therefore, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, it generates a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles, and it also generates an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles, which means that it has complete access to all of it can regulate its own economic activity. So that's legal warfare, but it's also trying to blur distinction. So under international law, within that 200 nautical mile limit, you cannot regulate the activities of foreign navies. So you can't say you need to get prior permission until before you bring your ship or you fly over our airspace. But China are basically saying, no, you need to get our permission before you do that. So that's legal warfare in action. Psychological warfare is that it has been sort of bombarding Vietnam, the Philippines, all of the other claimants to these islands in the South China Sea in terms of putting oil rigs within their strategic territories, like it did with Vietnam in May 2014. It moved an oil rig closer to their coastline, and then it moved it back. But again, just before Vietnam's top leader visited the US to try and get closer US-Vietnamese ties, it moved it back. So it's signalling, we're not happy with what you're doing. And then that, again, is served up for sort of domestic and international consumptions via its media. So they'll ram home saying that these are all Chinese territory. Look at what Japan is doing. Look what Vietnam is doing. Particularly with the way that Philippines has taken it to The Hague, they're saying, well, this is just stirring up trouble.
Ben, I mean, listening to both Mark and Laura, and what strikes one is the ability of an authoritarian regime, as opposed to a democratic regime, to sort of, well, Laura used the word holistic, which actually I think is one of the times where actually the word holistic is really the right word to use. A bit like narrative, it tends to get overused. But it sort of really takes sort of legal warfare, economic pressure, diplomatic games, media, and to kind of unite them all. Because unless you buy into sort of the theory that the BBC, I don't know, all British companies, Google, are all actually run by a shadowy person underneath number 10, I assume that's much harder for a democracy to do. I mean, you worked, but you're a very well-known analyst in information warfare. You're also a press officer at NATO dealing with Russia. What can democracies do, or are they always going to lose at this game? Or should they maybe even start, I don't know, do they start abandoning some of their democratic instincts and start creating their own media and economic sort of centralized institutions?
To take your last point first, no, they don't, because frankly, the authoritarian regimes are always going to be better at being authoritarian than we are. We still have democratic checks and balances. We should say, thank heaven for that. But you cannot possibly get a democracy being as good as an autocracy at being autocratic. It just doesn't work. So if, for example, the government were to try and streamline the BBC, ITN, Channel 4, and tell them all to do the same thing at the same time, can you imagine what you would get on the BBC News that night? It would be a bloodbath. You cannot do it in a democracy with democratic traditions because it's embedded too long.
The Queen? You get the Queen on in one go.
Right, but she's not telling them what to say. They are all covering the same main event because they have decided that's the big event of the day. I'm assuming they are covering us live right now for the same reason, but you know, we can hope. In terms of the democracies, I think the bitter pill which democratic governments need to swallow is that in an awful lot of this, the best thing they can do is shut up. Particularly since Iraq and the famous dossier proving that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for a government official to say, we know that the bad guys are doing this because we've got a dossier on it, really doesn't have a great deal of credibility. Something which has been very interesting with the Ukrainian conflict is that the people who have been most effective at debunking the Russian myths have been open source, non-governmental actors. There's a Ukrainian website called StopFake, which specializes in picking up fake news produced both by the Russians and the Ukrainians surrounding the Ukrainian conflict and saying, well, actually, the report was that a child was crucified in Donbass, but actually it's fake for these reasons. That has got a very wide following. That has been picked up a lot by the Western media because it is non-governmental, it is independent, and therefore it is seen as more credible. In the same way, there's an investigative journalism group called Bellingcat, who've done a lot of work on social media imagery, and they have specialized in finding selfies taken by Russian soldiers on their way from Russia into Ukraine and then in Ukraine, and then they've published them. And so if Putin is saying that the Russians have no troops on the ground in Ukraine, how come you have a selfie of Bato Dambayev and his tank in Ukraine? You could argue that he went on holiday, but was he really allowed to take his tank with him? It's an open question. And that is something which open source people can do far more effectively than governments can, because by definition governments are seen these days as spun. They are more liable to, they are seen, rightly or wrongly, as having an interest in presenting a particular facet of the truth, but not the whole thing. Whereas citizen journalists are seen to be much more likely just to tell it like it is.
But journalism is, I mean, that's very romantic. I mean, citizen journalism really doesn't have very many sort of resources to do much journalism with. Classical journalism is famously in a bit of a state of degradation, especially when it comes to the boring things like fact-checking and opening bureaus, and that's all going out the window. I mean, in the paper you introduced this interesting concept of information defense, which I suppose is an attempt to square that circle. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Basically, I started coming at this from the idea that in the information age, a lie can go around the world in 2 minutes. So on the 18th of March last year, Putin did his big speech about we are now annexing Crimea, as Mark has referred to. And one of the things he said at that point, which was the first time any senior Russian official had said it, was that we did this because otherwise Sevastopol would have been a NATO base. Nobody in the Russian government had said before then, we are afraid that Ukraine is about to join NATO. It hadn't come up. But Putin said it's all because they were about to join NATO. Within 20 minutes, that was being reported in The Australian. It was being reported in the Sydney Morning Herald. It was being reported in Auckland and Wellington. So that lie had literally gone around the world in 20 minutes. And that was disinformation. There was no talk at that point of Ukraine joining NATO. So these days, if you are concerned about disinformation, and if you are going to wait for the disinformation to come out, you're too late. By the time you have got your act together, 48 hours have elapsed, and again, as Mark would tell you, the confusion has been out there for 48 hours and Crimea is gone. And this was the thing with Putin himself, outed himself as a liar this April in the big documentary he did, you know, how I bare-chested rode into Crimea and ripped it off the continental shelf and brought it back to Russia all on my own while bringing back 2 ancient amphorae under my other arm, kind of thing. Putin said himself, yes, I gave the order on the 22nd of February, now we need to start returning Crimea. By so doing, he confirmed that the year before, when he had said consistently, nope, none of our guys there, he confirmed that he'd lied. Why did he do that? Because the lie didn't need to stand up anymore. The lie had been crucial from the 22nd of February when he gave the order through to about the 3rd of March, by which time the Russian special forces were fully in control of Crimea, to make sure that the West was so confused and scratching its head it couldn't take any concerted action. So the whole point of disinformation in the modern era is it spreads very fast and it doesn't need to last for long, it just needs to create confusion. Therefore, building on that, if you're going to counter it, if you wait for the disinformation to come out, you're too late. So what you need is preemptive information. And an example you can use, if I offer you a cup of tea and you've never drunk tea before, and I say, it's wonderful, it tastes of raspberries. You might well think, oh, it doesn't look like raspberries, but stranger things have happened. If you have already drunk tea, you will know that's rubbish. Tea tastes of tea, not of raspberries. So if you have pre-existing information, it is much harder to disinform you. And in the same way, for example, in Crimea, had there been a stock of Western or Western-linked journalists on the ground who've been there for years and know the whole subject and been able to talk straight to sort of BBC head office and the Financial Times and CNN and say, actually, we've been here for ages. There is no separatist movement. There never has been a separatist movement. There certainly hasn't been a separatist movement which has got 2,000 guys with AK-47s. Therefore, this cannot possibly be a genuine separatist movement, and therefore everything you're hearing to the contrary is disinformation. You wouldn't be able to stop the disinformation spreading, but at the same time as it went out, you would be able to say, hang on, there are very serious concerns about this information. And what governments should therefore be concentrating on is identifying key areas of concern. Where's going to be the next Crimea? Where's going to be the next Spratley Shoal? And getting not government people, but non-governmental people, journalists, NGOs, think tanks, academics, to go to these places and make contacts there and study them and build up a public stock of information, photo, video, audio, satellite imagery, so that if a crisis breaks out there, you already have a stock of educated experts who can say, well, hang on, we were there a week ago and we got satellite photos from a week ago and there was nothing there a week ago. So what has, you know, so you build up the stock of information so that you already know what the tea tastes like, so that when they try and tell you, here it tastes of raspberries, you can say, no, it doesn't.
I have a lot of questions, but we'll come back to that, because I wanted to, Laura, in your conclusions about what to do about Chinese the three warfares, it's vaguely similar. I mean, it's again this idea that you have sort of preemptively create sort of communities of critical inquiry and evidence before the problem breaks out. Tell us a few of the suggestions that you made.
Yeah, I think definitely sort of building upon from what Ben was saying, that we basically need education and information about what is going on. So, for example, when I was alluding to the fact that China is trying to blur legal distinctions, or it's trying to blur what international law treaties actually say, I think we need education, we need briefings about what's actually happening in the South China Sea. For example, the CNN, they actually had a crew on a military warship, a US military ship, and was able to broadcast signals from the Chinese ships that were telling them to leave the area, saying that you're within our an area that's within our territorial sovereignty, you need to leave. So being able to broadcast those kind of things where China is trying to blur those distinctions, that is what we need. We need also to prevent China being able to establish itself as a victim status. So, for example, if you have a military vessel that's exercising a freedom of navigation exercise, which is legally entitled to, and then flooding the area full of fishing vessels or its coast guard, and an incursion happens, you're able to show that video footage and say, look, this is what actually happened, and prevent China from saying, we're the victim here, you were illegally manoeuvring. So you have all of that video evidence, and then you're able to, maximise on that YouTube effect, which essentially takes the rug out of China's feet.
And wasn't there already a project, the Atlantic Council in the US, which sort of does satellite photos non-stop of...
Yeah.
What is that again?
Exactly. That's the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Essentially,
vital viewing.
They're taking photographs of all of the different reefs that China are building upon on sort of a daily or weekly basis, and they have it all online, so you can see the construction that's happening. So even though China said in August this year we're going to cease all land reclamation activities, you can see that it's building. It's got 3 airstrips now that are substantial. Upon 3 out of the 4 reefs that it's reclaimed. So we can see that, China is not sticking to its word.
Okay, we've got 20 minutes, because today I've been told by everyone that we have to finish at 7:30. We've got 20 minutes for questions. When there are questions, a microphone will come round, but please introduce yourselves so that other people know who you are. I'm actually going to ask the first question. The news is full of Syria and Russia, because we've in terms of narrative, manoeuvres, the Russian sort of gambit in Syria is to my mind quite, from a narrative point of view, in its own way, very brilliant. But tell me about sort of, because you've been looking at that quite closely, haven't you? And you've managed to see some sort of like classic sort of narrative and rhetorical sort of techniques being used.
That's right, and the main thing was that President Assad did a very rare 1-hour interview with some of the main state Russian media last week, and he was asked a lot about the Syrian crisis, what Syria's relations are with some of its neighbours. He was not asked about what help Syria is getting from Russia, which is curious given that it was Russian journalists asking the questions. But if you read through that speech or that interview that Assad gave, I would swear it was scripted in the Kremlin. It's ticking all the points that Putin and Lavrov have been making, that there has to be a military coalition against IS, that the only people capable of fighting IS on the ground are Assad's forces, that the US-led coalition is totally ineffective, that the only reason thousands of people or millions of people are fleeing Syria is they are fleeing from IS. No mention of poison gas, no mention of barrel bombs, for example. And so it's a rebranding of reality. And Putin started it on I think it was the 4th of September, when he was saying we need a big international coalition. The Americans and their friends just aren't doing it, so everybody else needs to join in. And if you look at the way Assad's rhetoric worked, there are four key techniques which the Russians use when they are issuing propaganda. They will try and dismiss either the critic or the criticism. So they will say, well, if the OSCE monitors say that the rebels were using cluster munitions against civilians, well, the OSCE is biased. They will distort things. So if NATO says we are going to reinforce our NATO response force, our rapid reaction force, and it could be up to 30,000, then the same day that happened, the head of the Russian National Security Council came out and said, NATO is going to station 30,000 rapid reaction troops in Poland, which is pure distortion. They would be based in their home countries and they would be deployed anywhere they were needed. But the Russian line from the head of the NSC was, they'll all be in Poland. Either he's not very well briefed or that was deliberate. They will distract. So they will say, well, it doesn't matter what we're doing here. What about what you did in Yugoslavia? They will accuse you of the same thing. Or they will try and dismay you. They say, well, if you do that, if you're Finland and you're trying to join NATO, well, you'll be starting World War III. And of those four, Assad was using dismissal. He was saying, well, all the rebels are extremists and the Americans are no good. He was using distortion by saying that my forces are the only ones fighting on the ground. Well, tell that to the Kurds. He was using distraction by saying, well, it's all the fault of the Americans and the Europeans. They started the whole crisis because of because they were supporting, what was it, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda and IS. They're all Western constructs. So all those things are the absolute classic Russian rhetorical techniques. You put that together with Russian journalists interviewing him for the Russian press, clearly with the blessing of Putin, and it's a week before the UN General Assembly. What are they doing? They're floating up all kinds of smoke screens. It's UNGA coming up. Putin is going to be under real pressure. What are you doing in Ukraine? What are you doing in Syria? He's trying to turn the rhetorical tables and say, well, it's the fault of the EU and the US. They have to defend themselves. Their coalition hasn't worked. And on the coalition itself, he's saying we need to have a grand coalition of everybody. He clearly hasn't looked at who's actually doing strikes in Syria at the moment, because it's the Bahrainis, the United Arab Emirates, apart from the US, it's Bahrain, the UAE, Jordan, Turkey, and the Saudis. If you can think of 5 countries which hate Assad more, you will be doing well.
So it's distract,
dismiss, distort, distract, dismay.
I'm going to keep this in mind for my next row with my wife, because the information war is most like Bergman's scenes from Marriage, I've realised. Questions, please.